good evening, good afternoon, good morning, dependent on where you are and where you're located. Greetings from Melbourne, and I think we're the last session of the day, so we want to talk to you about leadership, management and succession in a for-purpose world. First thing I would like to do is maybe move into some introductions. My name is Nick Sutcliffe. I'm the Managing Director of Oxford HR based in Asia, or Oxford HR Asia based in Singapore. Brief background, 15 years of running an NGO as an executive director, primarily around thought leadership in terms of business strategy, human capital and leadership. Happy to have joined Oxford HR about a year ago. Oxford HR is a global specialist executive search firm, partnering with for-purpose organizations to help recruit, develop their leaders in an ever-evolving landscape. And probably the reason I joined them is their vision, a world that puts purpose before profit, and really enables excellence in leadership for the purpose sector around the world. So we've got a great conversation this evening. I'm hoping not to have to speak too much because we really do have some bright sparks around the table. I'll do it in running order. Mayank, perhaps you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure, Nick. Mayank Parekh, born in India, but living in Singapore. HR professional for many years in various roles for big companies and even small companies. For the last 5 years, as it says there, I was the CEO of the Institute for HR Professionals based out of Singapore. And what that institute does is to help HR professionals understand what are the changes that are going on out there at their workplace and how they can better prepare themselves professionally to meet some of these organizational challenges. So yeah, and right now what I do is I do a little bit of everything, including lecturing at the local polytechnic. So happy to be here, Nick. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayank. Melanie.
Thanks very much, Nick, and hi everyone. Really pleased to be joining you this evening. I'm joining from Melbourne, Australia. I'm currently head of Humanitarian at Save the Children Australia. I've worked for Save the Children in a number of different roles over the years, primarily working in humanitarian responses in Asia Pacific and the Middle East. And I've also spent a number of years working at the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership, where I was the Humanitarian Foresight and Policy Analyst. And so we'll have the opportunity this evening, I think, to reflect on some pieces of work that I was involved in those roles as well. But very much looking forward to the discussion today. Thanks.
And finally, not least, Ottilia.
Hello, everyone, and good day wherever you are. My name is Ottilia Dube, and I'm with Oxford HR Consulting. I've been with them for the last 2.5 years. I'm based in South Africa in Pretoria, and I'm here to represent Africa in this Asia conference. I come from a background in HR, and I have worked for Action Aid, for SOS Children's Villages, for Oxfam International, and also for DFID, who are now the FCDO. Thank you very much, Nick.
Thank you. Thank you. And so really the purpose of today's session is to share some of the insights from Oxford HR's research in terms of understanding for purpose leadership. Also to consider additional research, which I think is absolutely great reading and well worth a look. And I'm happy to share the links afterwards. But certainly INGOs and the Long Humanitarian Century, of which Melanie was a contributor. There was also additional information that Melanie shared during our conversation, and I think is a great read and a valuable lead for the humanitarian practitioner, which really entails the skills for the future humanitarian practitioner. And finally, we want to share some hot off the press findings, not yet published, we've basically within Oxford HR been undertaking some research to understand from an Asian and an African context, what are the key challenges facing NGOs? But more importantly, what are the strategies for dealing with those challenges? And so by combining these insights, we will start from what I would describe as a macro view, a long distance, high up view, and begin to drill down until we begin to define what does leadership look like? And what are some of the strategies we can utilize to develop those leadership skills within our organizations? So I'm going to ask a little pop quiz of my partners in crime. I've got a list here of what we define as some of the key challenges within the NGO world. It's not finite. There may be others. There may be other ideas that you want to talk to. But perhaps you could share from your perspective the top 2 or 3 challenges from this list, or if there are others. So Melanie, your thoughts?
Thanks very much, Nick. Yeah, I mean, certainly a lot to speak to for every one of those dot points. I think what really stands out to me, if we look at the deteriorating financial and economic conditions, I think what that really speaks to me is about the scale and nature of crisis that NGOs are currently facing, and also the funding pool available to help respond to those crises. I mean, from a humanitarian perspective, we know that just on UN funded appeals alone, we're looking at around 50 billion USD in order to meet the need. That's 10 billion up on last year. We've seen 25% jumps in the number of people who are in need of humanitarian assistance. And I think those figures really speak to the multi-layered nature of crisis. We hear the term polycrisis, I think, being referred to quite frequently these days, but between COVID, inflationary pressures, food insecurity, conflict, climate change, I mean, I think all of these are playing a factor in what we're seeing around the deteriorating financial and economic conditions. And while the total amount of funding available for the not-for-profit sector may in real terms continue to grow, the challenge really is that with the need growing so exponentially, the funding available and the gap, is just really not enough to meet the need, and the gap continues to grow. So I think the challenge for NGOs is really how to make those strategic decisions, none of them easy decisions, about where to focus and where to channel resources in light of those constraints.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Mayank, anything further to add?
Yeah, I think coming from a HR background, I would think certainly the people and culture piece, as well as leadership, comes to mind. I think a lot of commentators are looking at the workplace being very different today, and a lot of it has to do with changing mindsets, changing behaviors that we see out there. So that really needs organizations to take a hard look at their internal processes, their internal structures, to see how they can best position themselves for this new world of work, so to speak. So I would think that that twin challenge around getting talent, the war for talent is still active, and NGOs are not immune by any means to that. And the need for leadership, the need for succession discussions for NGOs, those would be critical at this point for NGOs to ride the wave. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ottilia.
I looked at it and I thought, particularly on the African perspective of the NGO world, and the deteriorating financial and economic conditions like the rest of the world, affect Africa in terms of reduced resourcing, accessibility of resources, and with it is the issue of localization, where funds now have to be sought and resources have to be sought on a local basis, and yet the need is growing globally and in local spaces. The competitors for the resources are increasing, and therefore there is a need for the NGOs to work harder to access resources. I also thought about it in the eyes of people and culture, and with an emphasis on increased access to each other across the world, and also looking at the perspective and context of the spaces that NGOs work, and also thought around the issues around gender and access, empowerment, and also thinking around the different edges where we see that most NGOs are still led by people my age or older, and yet the bigger population is of very young people. And so the issue of people and culture becomes important in terms of thinking about how NGOs function and how they provide for the needs of their stakeholders. Then I also targeted technology and digital transformation, because it allows the world to have access to each other, to have access to resources, and to have access to information, to share information, and even to distribute resources. And yet you'll discover that with deteriorating financial and economic conditions, it actually means that the access to technology and digital transformation is reduced, and therefore the NGOs world is affected in that there are not enough resources to go around. And yet at the same time, there is a need for capacity building to use technology when it is available, and there is reduced resources for people to actually access those the technology and the digital world. Thank you.
Thank you, Ottilia. So what was interesting there is we got quite a broad range of ideas, a broad range of thoughts, perceptions. Interestingly, Ottilia, I was on your side, technology, digital transformation, all the tools to drive productivity within the NGO world. But obviously there's no right answer, there's no wrong answer. It depends where you sit, what your perspectives are, what your role is. But fundamentally, I think there is a core challenge, which is the financial and economic conditions, which affect everybody. They affect levels of investment, they affect levels of aid. So fundamentally, there is a broad choice. We wanted to get a picture of those challenges from our own survey within Oxford HR, but then I also found that the work had already been done in terms of INGOs and the long humanitarian century, and this is really an indicator of what will shape the international NGO ecosystem. I think, and there's a typo there, so apologies, it should be by 2030. But we're seeing localization, we're seeing money, we're seeing donors, we're seeing geopolitical challenges, technology, etc. And further down, though, we're seeing leadership, we're seeing civil space, the voice of local people. So my concern when I begin to look at this is we wanted to look at it from a short-term perspective. And what we found was that obviously the financial challenges are there, but there's also leadership, management, succession as major challenges. There's also enhancing transparency and improving governance. So as we begin to drill down and as we begin to look at these challenges, we're beginning to see sort of commonality in terms of what are perceived as those challenges, but also some diversion, and that's in particular around leadership, management, and succession. And we'd like to drill down there a little bit further to understand what does leadership, what does management, and how can we derive succession. I'm based in, as I said, Singapore. If I spoke to an Asian business leader about succession planning, he would traditionally look at me, then ask me to leave the room, simply because we were really insinuating his own mortality. And the last thing he wanted to discuss was that whole challenge of succession. Yet, if you work with a Fortune 500 company, the challenge of succession is always there, and it's an integral part of the role of a CEO to ensure there is a succession plan in place. So what is good leadership? I saw this quote. I thought it was an absolutely great quote. So first of all, good leadership is distributed throughout organizations. It's not just the CEO that can be the leader. Everyone can be a leader. It's in a different way, in a different domain. I think being a leader is about stepping out of your comfort zone. And this came from our research within the Oxford HR report looking at leadership. But again, we'll be touching upon other sources as well. So when we began to think about leadership, we began to think about the challenges. And certainly one of the key challenges was retention, recruitment and turnover. We talked about human resource development, and we talked about influence of the donor. And Melanie and I had a great conversation about this. And maybe I'd like to just draw upon Melanie's thoughts about how does a donor impact the design of leadership or the structure of leadership within an organization. Do you have any particular points you want to add to this?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think, I mean, as we saw on the little infographic you displayed earlier, this question of money and donors, certainly from the leadership survey I was involved in, has been very much front of mind for leaders. And the reality of operating, I think, in the NGO sector is that many organisations are still very reliant on main institutional funding, and that, of course, we're always looking to see how much we can contribute to programming, but then there's not always, there's always then the challenge of really trying to understand how we can best support the people and leadership capacities of those people within NGOs as well. We don't always have then, I suppose, the flexibility of funding to necessarily invest in some of those areas. And I think that probably came out also in the Oxford HR survey. And so I think certainly in the leadership survey that I was part of, that question of the role of the donor and being able to have financial sustainability is very much front of mind. And to the extent that it impacts on leadership, I think it does take up a very significant amount of leaders' headspace in terms of being able to ensure they can keep the lights on, so to speak, and ensure that they're able to fulfill the strategies of their organisations. So certainly the role of the donor there is very, very present in all aspects, because many organisations are simply very reliant on those funds, and that has, I think, a flow-on effect throughout the organisation.
Yeah. I'm going to move forward with this. Just bear with me a second. Question from Matilda. Matilda, if you don't mind, I'll come back to the questions as we move towards the end of the session. We've got quite a lot to cover. You're noted. I will come back to you on this. First, let me touch upon the strategies. And this was really interesting because what we wanted to do was, everybody talks about the problem, but what are the strategies for fixing the problems? And the number one strategy was really to define future leadership. And this is interesting because if you work within the corporate world, what you are finding is that a lot of organizations have spent a lot of money defining what future leadership looks like. Then came COVID, which entirely changed leadership again. And leadership is evolving and changing. And certainly I'll be talking to Mayank about his perceptions from the corporate world as we move forward. Another area that Ottilia touched upon in terms of increasing diversity, increasing inclusiveness within leadership, that cross-cultural competency. The area that I'm interested in is that option of agility and adaptability. How do we create agility within leadership? The rest of the strategies I would define more as fundamental HR strategies in terms of training and development, in terms of autonomy, in terms of recognizing potential, in terms of providing opportunities. So if you're on a hypo program in a Fortune 500 company, you're sent to different countries to operate. I'm not saying that all of the NGO world has that flexibility, but we do have opportunities for developing leaders. We need to incorporate leadership development programs in performance management plans. I spent a lot of time looking at workforce analytics and data around leadership. And what we found is that those leaders who are rewarded for developing leaders are often more successful. And those leaders that are developed internally know the values, know the culture, and are able to maneuver quickly within the organization. The other areas that we wanted to look at as we begin to drill down was this thought about what can the INGO world, the international NGO sector, learn from people externally. People need to understand the capacity building, the entrepreneurial mindset, the resource allocation. I'm not saying it's not there. I'm just being maybe a little bit contentious and a little bit pushy, but we need to have a more integrated approach. Finally, I wanted to share something that I wrote pre-COVID, and this was part of a research piece around the future of work. And when you begin to consider the future of work, you've got to really consider the future environment, the future of leadership, the future workforce styles. And if you think about the old work environment, it was a physical location. You were nailed to your desk. Now people are working all over the world. There was a focus on productivity, and now people talk about agility and wellness. There was a focus on control and rigid rules, and now we're seeing people being more purpose-driven, more flexible around work-life balance. The structures are breaking down. And when we begin to consider then the workforce has changed in its way it operates. We all know and we all recall the 9-to-5 environment. I remember my parents talking about a job for life. I remember working in environments where certain teams were hoarding information and not sharing. There wasn't the collegiate way of operating. Learning has become democratized. We can work anywhere. We can work on any device. We're actually doing this today. It's 9 o'clock in Melbourne, but we're still working, but we're working on something we want to work on. And we're sharing information, and we're using different tools, and we're talking to people all over the world. And hopefully, as we move through this conversation, we'll begin to use the collective wisdom of those people listening to share insights and share learning. And then ultimately, you've got to think about what is leadership and how is leadership redefined. The days of the rock star leader, the days of the my way or the highway are gone. We're seeing more servant leadership. We're looking at people who share power, who put the need of employees first, rather than stakeholders, donors, etc. We're looking for people who can mobilize talent, not hoard talent. We're looking for people who can reap and share the collective intelligence. And probably one of the most important leadership skills, the ability to challenge, the ability to innovate. And finally, the ability to foresee change. This came about in all of the research I read, that the leaders need to be able to react to change of environment, change of donor, change of economic situation, etc. But they need to foresee it and be proactive rather than reactive. And then finally, this comes from Skills Future for the humanitarian practitioner, a conversation with Dr. Hugo Slim, again, Melanie was involved in this, and we again see skill sharing, meaningful collaboration. We see negotiating the digital landscape. We see adaptability, and we see navigating complex problems, including bureaucracy. So that's what I've got to say. Now I think we really want to listen to people who are probably far more informed than I am. So we're talking about Ottilia, we're talking about Mayank, and we're talking about Melanie, and we wanted to talk about really sort of what they see. And the first question that I want to really look at it, and I'm going to go to Ottilia first on this, is in terms of what do you see as the primary organizational challenges within the NGO or within the humanitarian world for developing leadership?
My thoughts when I looked at this were on a topic that's within the corporate and the NGO world, and that's the issue of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And if you look at the slide that Nick shared on what the new leadership looks like, it all speaks to EDI, because it is about working and creating space where everybody matters. So looking at the challenged NGO and the leaders and how they need to go forward, it's then important that leaders look at themselves and their organization, and they start by making open the opportunities. And to make open the opportunities, there needs to be self-awareness of leaders as individuals, as leaders, as a collective within the organization, and the organizational challenges and priorities. So what is it that we could do? Where would we go? The thing that makes it work is equity. And over the years within the NGO world, we have spoken about equality. Equity and equality are not the same. Equity then says, how do we make each other equal? And it's looking at the perspective of your team or of an organization and thinking about how do we give others advantages to reach where others are. It is about setting goals towards greater equity and actually taking action. Are there restorative things that we can do that could even look at the budgets? What priorities would we give to programming? What transformational things can we do as servant leaders? Are there issues around restorative justice? Is there positive affirmation that we need to take? And then working directly towards that. At the same time, we need to think about diversity and not just look at it and say, we acknowledge our differences. We need to activate the diversity. That way, when we have identified what our differences are, we need to then think about how do we accommodate, work with each other, and actually celebrate our differences and take advantage of our differences of our diversity in terms of the way we approach the work. Having done that, it's important for us to actually set up KPIs in terms of where we are going and what we'd like to achieve. So it's thinking about being representative in the way we do things and even in our service provision. It's thinking about having safe spaces where people can openly speak about what they observe and how they feel. And even as things are happening, how it is affecting others emotionally. Because we may think about creating equity and yet it affects those that may have been previously advantaged. It's thinking about what inclusivity looks like within leadership, within the committees, within the work that we do. I've often come across a saying that says, if you're going to do something for us and you're going to do it without us, what does it really mean? So how do we then become inclusive? And more importantly, in this whole implementation and awareness space, is to think about how do we capacity build leadership within our teams and the wider organization and the stakeholder community to actually understand what it is that we're doing and why we're doing it and why it's important. Then we need to think about leading and managing inclusively. And sometimes it also includes being allies to things that we perhaps do not basically agree with or were not in our perspective, and going and supporting a cause, new causes that were not even in our initial strategies, because we are being inclusive in our nature. It talks to the languages that we use. And we may have to change our formal language to a more inclusive language that incorporates the younger people, or a new community that we are entering so that we are understood and we are accepted. It's about building skills for maintaining and developing new cultures. It's also about openness to what our challenges are and how we can get help from others and allowing others to contribute. And it's also about taking feedback from others and acting on the feedback. Nick, I think that should be enough for now.
No, that's great. And to a certain extent, you've also answered Matilda's question, which construct of culture was dominant in our study. And I think when we begin to consider the constructs, the one of cultural awareness, in particular self-reflection, one's own cultural and professional background, and the need for cultural knowledge were very strong in terms of the essence of the results that we're seeing through. I'd maybe want to take it from another angle now and talk to Mayank and say, look, Mayank, you and I have both worked in sort of what we would describe as the professional world, or the business world, and we've worked at it from a HR and a leadership perspective. What are you seeing that we should maybe consider as takeaways in terms of leadership development, succession planning, and the like? What's your thoughts from that perspective?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think sometimes the for-purpose sector looks at the commercial world almost like it's the other side of the world. It might as well be in Mars. So it's something that goes back to perhaps what we talked about: financial resources. A lot of NGOs are strapped financially. They don't see themselves in the same league, if you like, in terms of some of the practices that the bigger companies out there, commercial companies, can do. There's also a feeling of it is we have a different culture. We do things differently, and things will not work for our sector. Having worked in both sides of so I've been on the board of some of the NGOs, and I think essentially there are things that for-purpose organizations can do and that revolves around four things, four simple things that they need to be asking themselves and thinking hard about. And the first is structure. Are they structured in a way that allows them to find good leaders, to keep good leaders, to develop those leaders? So structures are things like, do they have the right jobs within the organizations, which can help groom, if you like, the next generation of leadership for their companies? Do they have the right ability around, you mentioned it, right? Giving opportunities to young talents to try different things, including, maybe try an overseas assignment, right? As a stretch assignment. So these are structures that can be designed around building good leaders and something that NGOs can do. The second thing that they need to look at is processes, right? Do they have the right processes to bring in talents, to keep those talents? Processes around, are employees engaged? Are you looking at providing the right type of support to some of your younger leaders? Are you ensuring your reward systems are supporting that leadership development piece? So there are issues around how organizations can improve their processes, whether it's in recruiting, in terms of engagement, or even in terms of developing their talents. The third area is around behavior. So, and behaviors really starts from the very top. And to Nick's point, where, if you go to an organization and you begin to talk about succession planning and you're shown the door, I think that leaders need to seriously think about how can they exhibit the right behaviors in order to develop the outcomes that they need. They need those local talents to come forward. They need opportunities. They need the ability to develop and groom those talents. But very much depends, whether that happens depends on what behaviors and what's the culture like within the organization that allows such outcomes to happen. And finally, as in all organizations, things get done only if it's part of their priorities. So prioritizing leadership development within the organization is something that's critical and necessary. And then once again, it starts from the board all the way down to leaders and how those priorities, I know we are all very, we are pulled in different directions. And certainly operational issues take precedence in many cases. But leadership takes time. Developing leaders takes time. So that it needs to have consistency around dedicating resourcing, consistency around ensuring that this remains firmly on the radar for the long term. So if you look at those four things, I think NGOs can help build that pipeline of leaders that they need to do in this very difficult and challenging world that they face.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on some really valid takeaways there, some simple tools, but I think there is an opportunity to enable cross-fertilization. I think there's lots of good professional HR leaders within the NGO world, but there are also great professional leaders within the business world. And I'm sure we should create a platform for them to talk to each other more often, to share experiences. I think that would sort of really be empowering for both sides of the table. The other point that comes to mind is when I started doing my research around strategic workforce planning and succession planning, the conversation used to be about having the right person in the right place at the right time. When I finished that work, the conversation had shifted within the corporate world to having the right person with the right skills in 5 years' time. So people were looking forward to and saying, what skills are we going to need rather than what skills do we have? And that sort of alludes then to the structure of the business. Do we have the right structure with the right skills in the right place to develop those future skills? The irony, of course, is if you talk to a HR professional, particularly in a time like now when there's economic downturn, the first budget to be cut is training and development. So there is that irony there, and I think it's a plaintive cry, whichever organization you work for, whether it's the private sector or the for-purpose sector, you're always crying out for budget and more budget to do training and development. So let's maybe shift now. We've looked at it from a diversity perspective. We've looked at it from a corporate perspective, and Melanie, I'm afraid you've got more experience than most of us in terms of the for-purpose side and certainly the humanitarian side. And what do you see as the challenges? What do you see as strategies to overcome this deficit of leadership talent going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And perhaps to just pick up on your point about that opportunity for sharing across sort of corporate and not-for-profit sectors, I think that idea of the cross-fertilization and sharing is really important. I think as we've just heard, there's opportunities to learn perhaps from the corporate sector, but equally, I think, you know, the not-for-profit sector, particularly in the humanitarian space, has a lot of experience in navigating complex contexts and uncertainty, which I think is becoming a skill set increasingly relevant, no matter what you do or what sort of side of what type of business you or organization you work in. So I think definitely opportunities for some sharing there. I think sort of reflecting on some of the leadership challenges, particularly that came up as part of the leadership survey, for example, perhaps I can reflect a little bit on that. I think certainly, I mean, one of the key issues that came out was something of a sense of stuckness that leaders were experiencing, feeling somehow caught between a vision of what the aid and development sector could look like and some of the realities and incentives that are built into the system, and feeling sort of that challenge of navigating, you know, those challenges in light of all of the constraints. But I think what we saw also coming through in the survey is that we also do have a lot of examples of leaders that are really taking different approaches and looking to sort of build communities of practice around how things can be done differently. So as much as we were able to reflect on some of the challenges that leaders were experiencing, we also saw examples where you know, leaders were really looking at how they might do things differently. In terms of leadership diversity was also, you know, a significant issue that arose in the survey. The question was really, I mean, we posed to leaders, do you think you have the right composition in your leadership team to be able to face the future with confidence? And what was interesting there was that a lot of leaders said, no, we don't, and we're trying to do better. One respondent to the survey actually said to us, did anybody say yes to that? I think acknowledging that there are certainly challenges in terms of ensuring that leadership teams are more reflective of the workforce and of the communities in which NGOs operate. And I think, though, we have seen quite a lot of positive change in that space. I think there's been quite a lot of critical reflection that's been driven, I think, by some of the wider discussions about power dynamics in the sector, that we now see that not-for-profits really are reflecting on this question of who has a seat at the table, who is part of the decision-making, and how do we more actively support and build pathways for people who've not traditionally been seated at that table to be able to be part of those leadership roles. And I think it's taken a very intentional pathway. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I think what we saw reflected in the leadership survey, at least, was an acknowledgement that this was an area that NGOs really needed to reflect on and work on, but that significant gains had been made. There was a lot more to do, but that it was certainly an area of significant reflection and attention. And I think the challenge as well is making sure that those sorts of opportunities are available across all levels and all different locations in an organisation. For example, it's one thing for perhaps say head office staff in an NGO to have access to professional development and leadership training opportunities. It's also vitally essential that those sorts of opportunities are made available to staff who are doing direct service delivery all across the globe. And how do we ensure that those sorts of opportunities are made available there? It's obviously challenging with busy business as usual and budget constraints, but I think having a very intentional approach to that and recognising that leadership comes from across the organisation and that the diversity of opinion and diversity of leadership actually strengthens organisations and challenges organisations and prompts them to think differently and do things differently is really important. So certainly still a lot of work to be done, but at least in the leadership survey we saw an acknowledgement of that and intentional approaches to recruiting differently, looking at through different networks and recognising that perhaps the old networks that might have been relied on are no longer fit for purpose.
They're great comments and great observations, and it's interesting because even within the search aspect of Oxford HR, we are seeing the need and organisations coming to us saying, "Could you get us a square peg to fit in this round hole?" Conversely, I'm also speaking to a lot of senior executives who've come out of the COVID environment, who've looked back at their life and said, actually, I want to do something good now. I want to give a little bit back. And these guys and ladies, or this cohort, have amazing skills, but they may be considered too old. They may be considered not diverse enough. So to a certain extent, I understand the values of driving diversity and inclusiveness, but there also has to be diversity of thought. And if you can attract talent that comes from that corporate world, that banking world, that finance world, that HR world that wants to give back, we should be harnessing those skills as well. So we're actually bang on time in terms of this conversation. I'm not sure how many people are listening, and I'm sure there is an opportunity afterwards to message me, message Melanie, message Mayank, Ottilia, any questions you have, or if you want to continue the conversation, or you want to access this research. I know it's late, and I know a lot of people will listen to this tomorrow, in a week, in a month. Hopefully will be turned into a podcast and go rising up the ranks. But are there any questions out there? Is there anybody listening? What I would like, whilst we're waiting for this slew of questions, is maybe to ask for your conclusions, your thoughts about the future of leadership, the future challenges, what do we need to consider? And I'll start with you, Mayank. What does the future of leadership within the INGO, the international NGO world, look like, do you think? What's your concluding thoughts?
Thanks, Nick. I think it's, something Melanie said really struck me, because I guess if a lot of for-purpose organizations have a sense, have a feeling of hopelessness and the fact that they're stuck. Really, I think it's similarly true in the corporate world. And what corporates have done is taking advantage of all the change that's coming up is really do a big reset around what they've traditionally been doing, look at new ideas, not be afraid to try, experiment with things, and have that sense that it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter that things are tried and they don't work out, because I think that's just the way the world is getting used to these days. There is no one claims to have all the answers, and there's a wide recognition that we have to try different things, and this is possibly something that NGOs can certainly take back and make use of. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Mayank, and thanks for your sharing as well. It was really, really insightful and it's much appreciated. Ottilia, the future, conclusions, thoughts.
I came to a short conclusion that simply says, while we are leading for today, can we look at future sustainability? Today's needs are a reflection of what's coming on, and our leadership today provides a platform for future leadership. Thank you.
Excellent. Melanie.
I mean, I think it's just really important to hold leadership skills as something that really needs to be invested in. I think many people progress, of course, in a career path because of their technical skills and knowledge. But I think what we're increasingly understanding is that leadership skills are often a different set of skills, and we need to be really intentional about ensuring that people have those skills alongside their expertise in various areas. And I think the question of, what sort of approaches work, I think as we look in the humanitarian sector, particularly as we look to how to build a more networked system, a more decentralized system, a less hierarchical system, I think the leadership skills that are being promoted really need to speak to navigating that environment and how to build relationships, how to build consensus, how to navigate complexity, how to navigate change. I think all of those are particularly valuable moving forward when we're navigating uncertain environments and perhaps looking at how we can have a more sort of cohesive system that's built on relationships rather than the sort of power structures perhaps that we've seen as prevalent in the past. So I think that really needs to be reflected in approaches to leadership skills so that it can best fit the vision that the sector is perhaps moving towards.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. To address a few comments, Vardy, yes, the materials will be available. I'm sure Deacon will be sharing them on the platform. Angela, thank you for listening. Jessica, thank you for your comments. She enjoyed the conversation, so thank you, panelists. From Judith, listening for sure. It really is interesting about the power shifts and the disruptions taking place, not just in the NGO world, but the whole world. I'm sorry to hear that late learning and development are the first things drop money-wise. Yes, we are always trying to change people's assumptions. I think I can address maybe some of these things. As we move forward, the world is becoming more analytical. You have to be able to define the value of investment, what you've spent, what's the return on investment. And I think if you're going to go through this leadership journey, embrace workforce analytics, embrace data, embrace information, embrace content, and begin to think about it not so much as a nice thing to do, but an imperative. And as an imperative, it has to be part of your strategic plan and your strategic investment. So invest wisely, invest in leadership, and invest in the sustainability of your organization. Again, thank you to everyone who listened. Thank you to the panelists, Melanie, Ottilia, Mayank, you were awesome. Couldn't have done it without you. Yoshi, thanks for your support. And finally, Deacon Events and everybody else at Deacon, thank you for the platform. We really appreciate it. If you need more information, feel free to reach out to me. I'm on the chat, I'm on the platforms, and you can certainly contact us. So again, thanks for your time. It's late. Time for a glass of sherry and maybe retire. So thank you all. Good night.